The city of Bikini Bottom does not exist on a single point in time. It exists across hundreds of millions of years. The same pineapple house that SpongeBob lives in today was, in some prehistoric form, a stone hut on the same patch of ocean floor 400 million years ago. The same Squidward who works at the Krusty Krab today was, 2,000 years from now, replaced by a chrome robot in a floating glass tower. The show has been quietly building a timeline since 1999 that stretches from the prehistoric ocean to a far future robot civilization, with the present-day city sitting at the exact midpoint of that timeline. Tonight, we walk slowly through every era of Bikini Bottom in chronological order, from the first sea sponges in the prehistoric reef to the last chrome tower in the year 4017. Welcome to Cartoonology. Let's get started. The prehistoric ocean and the first sponges of Bikini Bottom. The earliest piece of canon in the entire SpongeBob universe is not the pilot episode. It is not the first appearance of any of the main characters. It is a flashback to a version of the world that exists hundreds of millions of years before the modern city of Bikini Bottom was ever built. The flashback appears in the 14th episode of Season 1, an episode called SB-129, which aired on December 31st, 1999. The episode is built around time travel. Squidward, trying to escape SpongeBob and Patrick on a Sunday morning, accidentally locks himself inside the freezer at the Krusty Krab. He is frozen for 2,000 years. When he is unfrozen, he discovers that the world has moved on without him, and he steals a time machine to try to get home. The machine malfunctions. Instead of returning him to his own present, it sends him into the deep prehistoric past of the same patch of ocean. There, in a setting the show has never explained in detail, Squidward encounters two creatures that look exactly like primitive versions of SpongeBob and Patrick. The two creatures cannot speak. They communicate in grunts and squeals. They have sloping foreheads, large overbite teeth, and they wear nothing except crude loincloths made from underwater plant material. They are afraid of jellyfish. When they see one, they scream and run away, and then one of them picks the jellyfish up out of curiosity and gets stung repeatedly because he does not understand what is causing the pain. The episode plays this for comedy, but the implication is canonical and significant. The species that will, hundreds of millions of years later, become SpongeBob and Patrick already exist in the prehistoric ocean. They are recognizably the same creatures. They have the same body shapes, the same skin tones, the same basic anatomy. They are simply, at this point in their evolutionary history, not yet civilized. The episode does not give the prehistoric versions of the characters names. The names come later. In the Season 3 episode Ugh, which aired on March 5th, 2004, as a special 22-minute single segment, the show returns to the prehistoric setting and gives it more depth. The episode is presented as a kind of nature documentary, with the same French narrator who introduces every modern episode, now narrating a much earlier era. The narrator introduces three primitive characters by name. The prehistoric version of SpongeBob is called SpongeGar. The prehistoric version of Patrick is called Patar. The prehistoric version of Squidward is called Squog. The three of them live in close proximity to each other in the prehistoric reef, in stone houses that mirror, in their early forms, the houses the modern characters will live in millions of years later. The detail of those stone houses is one of the most important pieces of the prehistoric canon. SpongeGar lives in a stone house shaped like a pineapple. The pineapple is not a real pineapple, it is a stone carving, but the shape is unmistakable. The pineapple as home tradition in the SpongeBob family stretches all the way back into prehistory. Patar lives in a stone outcropping that mirrors the flat rock the modern Patrick lives under. Squog lives in a stone tiki-style structure that has the same general silhouette as the modern Moai head. The three houses are arranged in roughly the same configuration that the three modern houses will eventually take on Conch Street. The neighborhood, in some basic form, has been the same neighborhood for hundreds of millions of years. The Ugh episode is built around the discovery of fire. SpongeGar finds a flame, accidentally, and is fascinated by it. He brings it home. Patar wants it. Squog, who is in this version of the timeline portrayed as the only one of the three with anything resembling adult intelligence, recognizes that fire is dangerous and tries to keep it contained. The three of them argue over the flame for most of the episode. They fight over it. They take it from each other. They invent, in the process of fighting, the basic tools of early civilization. SpongeGar invents the wheel by accident while rolling a stone away from Patar. Patar invents music by accident while banging on a hollow log. Squog Squag, watching this, becomes the first member of the species to understand the concept of art. The episode is short, but the implications are large. The civilization of Bikini Bottom, in its earliest form, is being invented in real time during this single episode. Then the fire is washed away by water. A wave comes through the prehistoric beach and extinguishes the flame. The three of them stand around the wet ashes. They look at each other. They realize that the thing they were fighting over is now gone, and that the only thing they have left is each other. The episode ends with them embracing in a quiet moment that the show treats with surprising emotional weight. The friendship that will, hundreds of millions of years later, hold modern Bikini Bottom together is, in this prehistoric flashback, being established for the first time. SpongeGar, Patar, and Squag choose each other over the fire, and the choice becomes the first social bond in the history of their species. The third major piece of the prehistoric canon comes from a 2009 episode called Truth or Square, which is a feature-length anniversary special that includes a separate flashback to an even earlier prehistoric era. The flashback shows a version of the prehistoric ocean that includes a primitive ancestor of the crabs family who lives in a stone hut shaped like a small lobster trap. The detail is minor, but it is canonical. The crabs family has been running food-related establishments in this region of the ocean for hundreds of millions of years. The lobster trap shape, the obsession with collecting things, the willingness to sell food to anyone who walks by, all of it predates the modern Krusty Krab by a span of time that is hard to even visualize. The earliest form of the Krabby Patty, in some primitive version, may have been served on flat stones in this prehistoric era, made of plant material that has since gone extinct. The prehistoric era also establishes the long evolutionary history of Gary the snail. The Ugg episode includes a prehistoric version of Gary, who is much larger than the modern Gary, and who is treated as a domesticated work animal rather than a household pet. The prehistoric Gary is more of a beast of burden. He carries heavy stones. He pulls primitive sleds. He is, in this era, closer in function to a prehistoric ox than to a modern cat. The implication is that the snail species has, over the course of hundreds of millions of years, slowly shrunk in size and shifted from a working animal to a household companion. The transition happened gradually, across countless generations, and by the modern era of Bikini Bottom, the descendants of the prehistoric work snails are the meowing pets that live in the pineapple houses of the modern city. The prehistoric canon raises a number of questions that the show has never directly answered. The biggest question is about the timeline itself. If the residents of modern Bikini Bottom are descended from the prehistoric SpongeGar and Patter and Squag, what happened in the hundreds of millions of years between the prehistoric era and the modern era? The show has never depicted any intermediate periods. There are no medieval flashbacks. There are no ancient Roman flashbacks. There are no 19th century flashbacks. The species seem to have simply existed in some quiet form throughout all of geological history, slowly developing intelligence and culture without any of the major historical periods that the surface world experienced. The most likely explanation, supported by the post-apocalyptic theory that we will return to later in this video, is that the species lived for most of their evolutionary history as ordinary marine animals. They were sponges and starfish and octopuses, behaving the way real sponges and starfish and octopuses behave. The prehistoric flashbacks, in this reading, show the rare exceptions, the moments when individual creatures briefly displayed proto-intelligence. The full civilization of Bikini Bottom did not emerge until something specific happened in the 20th century to accelerate the process. That something, according to the original concept of the show, as confirmed by longtime writer Mr. Lawrence in 2024, was the nuclear testing at Bikini Atoll between 1946 and 1958. The radiation accelerated millions of years of slow evolution into a few decades of rapid mutation, and the result is the modern Bikini Bottom that the show depicts. The prehistoric era, in this reading, is not the direct ancestor of the modern era. It is a glimpse of what the species was capable of in their earliest moments of development, before the long, quiet stretch of normal marine life that followed. SpongeGar and Patar and Squag were not the first generation of a continuous civilization. They were a brief flicker of intelligence in a species that would, for hundreds of millions of years afterward, return to being ordinary sponges and starfish and octopuses, until the bombs in the 1940s reawakened something that had been dormant since the prehistoric reef. The flicker, the dormancy, and the reawakening together form the rough shape of the entire timeline that the show has built. The prehistoric era is the first chapter of a story story that has been continuing in some form ever since. What makes the prehistoric flashbacks especially strange is that the show treats them with the same comedic tone as everything else. SpongeGar grunts and falls down. Patar eats a rock. Squog rolls his eyes. The audience laughs. But underneath the comedy, the canon being established is enormous. The species is ancient. The friendship is ancient. The neighborhood is ancient. The houses are ancient. Everything that the modern audience associates with Bikini Bottom has, in some form, been continuing in this small patch of ocean floor since long before any human civilization existed on the surface above. The cheerful sponge in the cheerful pineapple house is, in the truest sense, the inheritor of a tradition that began before the dinosaurs walked the earth. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The prehistoric era is the floor of the timeline. The next era is the long, quiet stretch that followed it, the millions of years when the species lived as ordinary marine life before something pulled them back toward intelligence. In the next section, we walk through the deep evolutionary middle, the dormant centuries, and the first signs of the modern city beginning to form. Section 2. The long, quiet stretch and the slow awakening of the reef. The hundreds of millions of years between the prehistoric flashbacks and the modern city of Bikini Bottom are the longest unbroken stretch of canonical time in the entire SpongeBob universe. The show has never depicted them directly. There are no episodes set in this middle era. There are no flashbacks. There are no character backstories that reach into it. The era exists only as an empty space on the timeline, a gap that the audience is left to fill in for itself. But the show has, across its run, scattered enough small pieces of canon throughout other episodes to suggest a rough shape for what happened during this long, quiet stretch. And the shape is consistent enough that it can be reconstructed. The era is, in many ways, the most important piece of the timeline that the show has refused to depict on screen, because it is the era that explains how the species got from the prehistoric flicker to the modern civilization without anyone in the world of the show remembering anything that happened in between. The first piece of evidence is the geology of the modern city itself. Bikini Bottom is built on a coral reef that has been growing, in real-world terms, for tens of thousands of years. Real coral reefs are slow. They build up at a rate of a few centimeters per year. The reef beneath the modern city, by the time the show's narrative begins, is a mature ecosystem that has been developing across the entire span of recorded human history and far longer. The buildings of the city are constructed on top of this reef. They follow the contours of the underwater landscape. The streets curve where the coral curves. The neighborhoods are arranged where the reef has the most flat surface area. The geology is a constraint that has shaped the city's layout for as long as the city has existed, and the geology itself is the product of the long, quiet stretch. Without the slow accumulation of coral over millions of years, there would be no foundation for the modern city to sit on. During the long, quiet stretch, the reef was simply growing. The species that would later become the residents of Bikini Bottom were living on it as ordinary marine animals. Real sea sponges, in real biology, are filter feeders that attach themselves to coral and other surfaces and spend their entire lives in one location. They do not have brains. They do not have nervous systems. They cannot move on their own once they have attached to a surface. By every standard that applies to real biology, a sea sponge is among the simplest of all multicellular organisms. The fact that SpongeBob, the modern character, is capable of speech and complex thought and emotional connection is, by real-world biological standards, impossible. Something must have happened to bridge the gap between what a real sea sponge is and what SpongeBob has become. The long, quiet stretch is the era when nothing was happening, when the bridge had not yet been built, when the species was still living the ordinary biological life that real sea sponges live today. The same applies to the other residents of the city. Real starfish, like Patrick, are predators that move slowly across the ocean floor and feed on shellfish by extruding their stomachs through their mouths. They do not communicate. They do not have personalities. Real octopuses, like Squidward, are highly intelligent by invertebrate standards and have been documented solving simple puzzles in laboratory settings, but they do not speak, they do not work jobs, and they do not live in carved stone houses. Real crabs, like Mr. Krabs, are scavengers that feed on whatever they can find on the ocean floor. Real plankton, like plankton, are the smallest organisms in the marine food chain, drifting passively in the water and being eaten by larger animals. Real pufferfish, like Mrs. Puff, inflate as a defense mechanism when they feel threatened. None of these animals, in their real-world world forms are capable of the kind of life the show depicts. Each of them, during the long, quiet stretch, was living the ordinary biological life that their real-world counterparts live today. For the long, quiet stretch, the species in this region of the ocean lived as their real-world counterparts do. They filtered water, they scavenged, they ate each other, they reproduced, they died. They did not build houses, they did not run restaurants, they did not have names. The flicker of intelligence that the prehistoric flashbacks captured was just that, a flicker, and after it faded, the species returned to being ordinary marine life for a span of time that is hard to measure in human terms. The reef grew, the coral built up, the sediment settled, the ocean above them changed and changed again as continents drifted and ice ages came and went. The species adapted in the slow way that real species adapt to the changes around them. They survived. They did not, for most of this stretch, do anything more than survive. The era was, by every measurable standard, the longest unbroken period of biological normalcy in the timeline of the show. The second piece of evidence for what happened during the long, quiet stretch comes from the show's occasional references to the deep sea. The city of Rock Bottom, which we will return to later in this video, is treated by the show as a separate world, located in a deep underwater trench, far below the modern Bikini Bottom. The residents of Rock Bottom are deep sea creatures, not the tide pool species that populate the main city. They have bioluminescent features. They have unusual mouth shapes. They speak a barely intelligible version of English, blowing a raspberry between every 2 to 4 syllables. The implication is that the deep sea species and the shallow sea species have been developing along separate evolutionary paths for a very long time, and that the deep sea version of intelligence is fundamentally different from the shallow sea version. The two groups did not develop at the same rate. They did not develop in the same direction. They are, by the time the modern era begins, almost two different civilizations. This split between the shallow species and the deep species must have happened during the long, quiet stretch. The two groups must have diverged at some point in their evolutionary history, with one group remaining in the warm, shallow waters near the surface, and the other descending into the cold, dark trenches below. The split would have happened gradually, over millions of years, as the species adapted to their different environments. The shallow species developed in the light. They saw colors. They felt warmth from the surface above. The deep species developed in the dark. They lost their pigmentation. They developed bioluminescence. They adapted to pressures that would crush a shallow water creature. By the time the modern era begins, the two groups are separate enough that they can barely communicate with each other. The bus that runs between Bikini Bottom and Rock Bottom in the famous episode that introduces the lower city has a schedule that seems to actively work against any visitor from the shallow waters. The two regions are not really part of the same world. The third piece of evidence for the long, quiet stretch is the Atlantis canon. In the special Atlantis SquarePants, which aired in 2007, SpongeBob and Patrick discover the lost city of Atlantis. The city is, in the show's universe, real. It exists. It is located somewhere in the ocean within reachable distance of Bikini Bottom. It is ruled either by King Neptune or by Lord Royal Highness, depending on which episode you are watching. The city has its own ancient history, its own architecture, its own technology, and its own population. The technology of Atlantis is, in some respects, more advanced than the technology of Bikini Bottom. The city has flying vehicles. It has advanced energy sources. It has a museum that contains artifacts from periods of history that the modern Bikini Bottom has no knowledge of. The Atlanteans, by the time SpongeBob and Patrick visit them, have been living their separate civilization for so long that they consider the surface dwellers to be primitive curiosities. Atlantis is, in this reading, a survival from the long, quiet stretch. The city must have been built at some point during the millions of years between the prehistoric flashbacks and the modern era. Its existence proves that the long, quiet stretch was not entirely empty. Somewhere in the ocean, intelligence was preserved. Somewhere, a civilization built itself, developed technology, and continued to exist while the species in the shallow reef returned to being ordinary marine animals. Atlantis is the missing chapter. It is the proof that the timeline of Bikini Bottom is not as simple as a prehistoric flicker followed by a long dormancy followed by a modern reawakening. Something else has been happening somewhere the entire time. The Atlantean civilization is older than any other civilization the show has depicted. The Atlantean technology predates the wheel by a span of time that is hard to fully process. The relationship between Atlantis and the rest of the ocean is left deliberately vague. The Atlanteans Atlanteans do not seem to have much contact with the residents of Bikini Bottom. The two civilizations exist in parallel rather than in cooperation. The Atlanteans are aware of the surface world and of the modern shallow water residents, but they have, for most of their history, kept to themselves. The implication is that Atlantis represents a different evolutionary path. While the species in the shallow reef were dormant, Atlantis was developing. While the shallow species were filtering water, Atlantis was building flying machines. The two timelines coexist, and the modern Bikini Bottom is just one of the threads. The Atlanteans, by the standards of the show's internal canon, are the senior civilization in the ocean. The residents of Bikini Bottom are the newcomers, the species that has only recently rejoined the world of intelligence after a long absence. There is also the canon of King Neptune himself. King Neptune is presented in the show as the ruler of the seas, a figure of immense power and authority who has been alive for at least several thousand years. He has a son, Triton, who appears in some episodes as a teenage rebel. He has palaces in multiple underwater locations. He is a deity-tier figure rather than a normal ocean resident. His existence implies that the long, quiet stretch had supernatural or near supernatural beings active during it, even if the everyday species were dormant. The ocean was not empty. It had its gods. King Neptune, by the canon of the show, has been ruling the seas since long before any of the modern characters were born, and he will, presumably, continue ruling them long after the modern characters are gone. He is the constant. The species rise and fall. He remains. The Flying Dutchman, who we will return to later, is another such figure, the ghost of a sailor who died long before any of the modern characters were born. He has been haunting the seas for centuries, possibly longer. The deep history of the ocean is populated by these long-lived or eternal beings who have witnessed the entire long, quiet stretch from beginning to end. They saw the prehistoric flicker. They saw the long dormancy. They saw the species return to ordinary marine life. They saw the slow awakening that began in the late 19th century. They will see whatever comes next. They are, in many ways, the only continuous witnesses to the full timeline of Bikini Bottom, and the show's canon treats them with the appropriate weight. They are not just supernatural figures, they are historical figures. They have been there. By the late 19th century, according to scattered references in various episodes, the species in the shallow reef were beginning to stir again. Mr. Krabs' grandfather, Grandpappy Redbeard, is shown in flashback episodes as a pirate who sailed the seas in the late 19th or early 20th century. The pirate canon implies that by this point, the shallow water species were already developing tool use and shipbuilding, which means the long, quiet stretch was beginning to end even before the nuclear testing of the 1940s. The reawakening was already underway. The bombs would accelerate it dramatically, but they were not the only cause. Something else, slower and quieter, had been pulling the species back toward intelligence for at least a few generations before the bombs ever fell. What that something was is not specified in canon, but the implication is that the species had reached a point in their evolutionary development where intelligence was, once again, becoming possible. The slow awakening of the late 19th century is one of the most quietly important pieces of the timeline, because it suggests that the modern Bikini Bottom is not entirely a product of the bombs. The species was already on its way. The bombs accelerated the process, transformed it, and gave the modern city its specific shape, but they did not create the intelligence from nothing. The intelligence had been building, slowly, across the final centuries of the long, quiet stretch. By the time the first pirate ancestor sailed his first ship, the species was already several generations into the awakening. The flicker that had gone dormant millions of years earlier was beginning to return. The bridge between ordinary biology and modern civilization was being built, plank by plank, by ancestors who would never live to see the city their descendants would eventually build. The end of the long, quiet stretch, in this reading, is not a single moment. It is a slow process that began in the late 1800s, when the first generation of pirate-era ancestors started showing recognizably modern intelligence. And it concluded in the mid-20th century, when the bombs at Bikini Atoll completed the transformation. The species had been ready. The radiation simply pushed them across the final threshold. The long, quiet stretch had ended, and the modern era was about to begin. The reef had been waiting. The species had been waiting. Whatever forces had pulled the species back toward intelligence had been working slowly, patiently, across the final stretches of the dormancy, and the bombs in 1946 found a population that was, in some quiet way, already prepared for what was about to happen to them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The long, quiet stretch lasted for hundreds of millions of years and ended quietly in the late 19th century. The species was beginning to stir, and the first ancestors of the modern characters were already on the seas. In the next section, we walk through the pirate era, the early Krabs family, and the centuries that built the foundation of the modern city. Section 3, the pirate era and the first ancestors of the modern cast. The pirate era is the first stretch of the Bikini Bottom timeline that the show treats as recognizably modern. The species are fully intelligent, they speak full sentences, they wear clothing, they use tools, they sail ships across the surface waters and the deep ocean. They have proper names that are passed down through their families. The era runs roughly from the early 1700s through the late 1800s, with most of the canonical pirate flashbacks set somewhere in the 18th or early 19th century. The era is not depicted in great detail in any single episode, but it is referenced often enough across the run of the show that a rough picture can be assembled from the pieces. The pirate era is, in many ways, the first stretch of canonical time where the show treats its underwater world as comparable to the human surface world. The species are no longer dormant. They are no longer ordinary marine animals. They are participating in the same kind of civilization that human history records during the same centuries. The most important figure in the pirate era is a character named Grandpappy Redbeard, the grandfather of the modern Mr. Krabs. He appears in the season 4 episode Grandpappy the Pirate, which aired on December 5th, 2008. The episode reveals that Mr. Krabs has a grandfather who is, in canon, a real pirate. Grandpappy Redbeard sails a ship called the Inflatable Avenger. He has a crew. He raids merchant vessels. He buries treasure on remote islands. He has, by the time of the modern era, been dead for an unspecified period of time, but his ship has been preserved, and his legacy still influences the Krabs family. Mr. Krabs idolizes him. The greedy, money-obsessed personality that defines the modern Mr. Krabs is, by canon, inherited directly from his pirate grandfather. The lust for gold and the willingness to do almost anything for it run in the family. The episode treats the inheritance as comedic, but the implication is structural. The Krabs family has been collecting wealth for generations, and the modern Mr. Krabs is just the latest link in a chain that stretches back into the pirate centuries. Grandpappy Redbeard's exact era is left deliberately vague. The episode does not give a specific year, but the visual cues suggest the late 1700s or early 1800s, which fits with the standard pirate era of human history. The clothes are appropriate to that period, the ship design is appropriate to that period, the weapons, the maps, and the language all match the conventions of pirate fiction set in those centuries. The implication is that, at the same time that human pirates were sailing the surface oceans, fish pirates were sailing the underwater equivalents, and the two groups were occasionally crossing paths in ways that the show has hinted at but never fully depicted. The pirate era of the underwater world ran in parallel to the pirate era of the surface world. The species had reached a level of development comparable to human 18th century civilization, and they were using that development for the same purposes humans were using it for. The pirate era also establishes Mr. Krabs' own personal history with the sea. According to canon revealed in episodes like Pull Up a Barrel, Mr. Krabs himself spent time as a pirate before settling down to run the Krusty Krab. His pirate years are placed somewhere between his childhood and his Navy service, which would put them in the late 1950s or early 1960s by the show's internal timeline. He sailed a ship, he had a crew, he sang sea shanties, he buried at least one piece of treasure on a deserted island. The pirate years are part of why Mr. Krabs has the accent he has, why he sings the songs he sings, and why he treats the Krusty Krab as a kind of land-based version of a pirate ship, with himself as the captain and SpongeBob and Squidward as the crew. The pirate phase of his life was, in his own internal narrative, the time when he was learning the trade that would eventually become the foundation of the Krusty Krab. The pirate era is also when the Patchy the Pirate connection enters the timeline. Patchy is a live-action human character, played by Tom Kenny, who hosts the SpongeBob holiday specials. He claims to be the president of the SpongeBob fan club. He lives in a house on the surface that is filled with SpongeBob merchandise. He has a parrot named Potty. The character is presented as a modern human, but the pirate dress and the sea-themed decor of his house suggest that he is, in some way, connected to the pirate era of the underwater world. There is a long-running fan theory that Patchy Patchy is, in some way, related to or even the same person as the Flying Dutchman, the ghost pirate who haunts the modern Bikini Bottom. The voice actor connection, with Tom Kenny voicing both characters, is the strongest piece of evidence. The show has never confirmed the connection, but it has also never denied it, and the pirate era is where the two characters would, in theory, intersect. Patchy, by this reading, is a descendant or distant relative of the same pirate lineage that produced the Flying Dutchman, living on the surface in the modern era, while his underwater counterpart continues to haunt the ocean below. The Flying Dutchman himself is one of the most important figures from the pirate era. He is, according to canon, a real pirate who lived and died at sea long before the modern Bikini Bottom existed. The exact period of his life is not specified, but the visual cues suggest the same general pirate era as Grandpappy Redbeard. He died at sea. His body was, after his death, used as a window display in a shop on the surface, and because he was never given a proper burial, his soul has been doomed to haunt the seas for the rest of eternity. He carries a handbag marked souls. He breathes fire from his nose. He grants wishes. He steals souls. He is, in the modern era, one of the most powerful supernatural beings in the ocean, rivaling King Neptune himself in raw, mystical power. The Dutchman is a kind of cautionary figure. His existence is a reminder that the pirate era was not without its costs, and that some of the figures who lived through it have, in supernatural form, continued into every era that followed. The Dutchman's continued existence into the modern era means that he has personally witnessed every period of Bikini Bottom history, from the pirate era through the present day. He has watched the long, quiet stretch end. He has watched the bombs fall on Bikini Atoll. He has watched the modern city grow up out of the wreckage. He has, by canon, been bonding with the residents of Bikini Bottom over shared interests for centuries, occasionally intervening in their lives in small comedic ways. He is the show's quiet acknowledgement that the ocean is older than the city, and that older things still walk through it. The pirate era is when those older things were first established as part of the universe. Before the pirate era, the show's supernatural canon was limited to figures like King Neptune, who had been there since before the species developed intelligence. The pirate era added a new layer of supernatural history, populated by the ghosts of the species itself, rather than the gods who ruled over them. The pirate era is also when the show introduces the first hints of the underwater nobility. Gary the Snail, according to the season 5 episode Rule of Dumb, is descended from royalty. The royal family tree of Bikini Bottom proves that Gary and Patrick are cousins, with their fathers being brothers. Patrick is, briefly in that episode, declared the rightful king of Bikini Bottom, and rules the city for several days before being deposed. The episode treats the revelation as a comedic plot device, but the canon stands. Somewhere in the family histories of the modern characters, there are royal bloodlines that go back to an earlier era. The Star family, Patrick's family, has nobility in its past. Whether that nobility is from the pirate era or from an even earlier time is not specified, but the implication is that the royal lineage predates the modern city and reaches back into the deeper history of the ocean. The starfish, who in the modern era live under flat rocks and watch television, are descended from creatures who once ruled the underwater world. The Cheeks family, Sandy's family, has its own pre-modern history. Sandy is a squirrel from Texas, but her family has been in the area she calls home for generations. The episode Texas, which aired in 2000, includes references to Sandy's homesickness for a place she calls just plain Texas, and she sings a song about how everything in Texas is bigger and better. The Cheeks family is implied to have been in Texas for at least several generations, possibly going back to the era when Texas was still a republic in the mid-19th century. Sandy's accent, her clothing, and her cultural references all suggest a family with deep roots in the American South. The Cheeks family lineage runs alongside the pirate era of the underwater world, but on land, in a parallel American timeline that connects to the show's universe through Sandy's eventual relocation to Bikini Bottom in the late 20th century. The Tentacles family, Squidward's family, also has pre-modern history. The season 3 episode House Fancy reveals that Squidward has a distant cousin, also a tentacled creature, who lives in a more upscale part of Bikini Bottom and is wealthy beyond reason. The implication is that the Tentacles family has, somewhere in its history, accumulated significant wealth, and that Squidward, despite being the descendant of that family, has somehow ended up in the lower middle class life of a fast food cashier. The pre-modern history history of the Tentacles family is not depicted directly, but the existence of wealthy relatives suggests that the family was, at some point, much more prosperous than Squidward currently is. Whether that wealth was accumulated during the pirate era or in some later period is not specified, but the family clearly has roots that predate the modern city. The pirate era is also when the show establishes the ocean's culture of treasure burying and treasure hunting. The episode Tea at the Tree Dome and several later episodes reference the existence of buried treasures scattered across the ocean floor, often guarded by traps or curses left over from the pirate era. The Krusty Krab itself, in some episodes, is implied to contain hidden treasure that Mr. Krabs has accumulated over the years. The treasure hunting culture is a direct descendant of the pirate era, when piracy was the dominant form of wealth accumulation in the underwater world. The modern era has, in many ways, simply civilized the practices of the pirate era. Mr. Krabs is no longer a pirate captain, he is a restaurant owner, but the impulse to hoard, the obsession with gold, and the willingness to do almost anything for money are all direct inheritances from the pirate centuries. The Krusty Krab is, in this reading, a pirate ship that has been moved onto land, with the crew replaced by employees and the loot replaced by daily revenue. The pirate era also produced the cultural artifacts that the modern Bikini Bottom still uses. The sea shanties that Mr. Krabs sings in some episodes are, in canon, real songs that have been passed down through the generations from the pirate era. The maps that occasionally appear in modern episodes are, in canon, real maps that were drawn during the pirate era and have survived into the present day. The pirate flag designs that decorate the Krusty Krab and other establishments are, in canon, real flags that were once flown by real pirate ships. The cultural memory of the pirate era is alive in the modern city, even though the era itself ended over a century ago. The species remembers, the species celebrates. The species, in some quiet way, still considers itself the descendant of pirates. By the late 1800s, according to scattered references, the pirate era was beginning to wind down. The surface world was industrializing. Steamships were replacing sailing ships. Naval forces were patrolling the seas more aggressively. Piracy, both above and below the surface, was becoming impractical. The species in the shallow reef were settling into more stable communities. The first signs of what would eventually become the modern city of Bikini Bottom were beginning to appear. The pirate era did not end suddenly. It faded slowly over the course of several decades as the world around it changed. The pirate ships were retired. The crews were dispersed. The captains, like Grandpappy Redbeard, retired to small homes near the reef and lived out their final years telling stories to their grandchildren. The era ended the way most eras end, not with a bang, but with a slow drift into something else. The pirate era ended somewhere around 1900, give or take a few decades. By the time the next era of the timeline begins, the pirates were mostly gone, the ships were mostly retired, and the species in the shallow reef were ready for the next phase of their development. That next phase would, within a few decades, be defined by something that nobody in the underwater world could have anticipated. The bombs were coming. The radiation was coming. The pirate era had been the long, slow buildup. The mid-20th century would be the explosion that changed everything. The species had spent 2 centuries developing pirate culture, building ships, accumulating wealth, and establishing the family lineages that would eventually become the modern caste. All of that work, all of that slow development, was about to be transformed by a single decade of detonations that nobody in the underwater world had any way of seeing coming. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pirate era ended quietly around 1900, with the species ready for whatever came next. What came next was something nobody could have predicted, a series of detonations on the surface above their reef. In the next section, we walk through the nuclear testing at Bikini Atoll and the moment Bikini Bottom became what it is today. Section 4, the bombs at Bikini Atoll and the birth of the modern city. The single most important event in the entire timeline of Bikini Bottom is not depicted on screen in any episode of the show. It is not mentioned by name in any official piece of canon. It does not appear in any character's backstory. But it is, according to longtime writer and voice actor Mr. Lawrence, in a December 2024 Esquire interview, the foundational event of the entire universe the show is built around. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States government detonated 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. Islands, with 23 of those weapons detonated specifically at Bikini Atoll. Those detonations are, by the original concept of the show, the moment when modern Bikini Bottom came into existence. The cheerful underwater city that millions of children watch every week is, by the original design of its creator, the product of those 12 years of nuclear detonations and the radiation that followed. The history of the testing is real. In the aftermath of World War II, the United Nations placed a vast region of the northern Pacific Ocean under the trusteeship of the United States. That region included the Marshall Islands. The United States government, looking for a remote location to test the next generation of nuclear weapons that had been developed at the end of the war, chose two atolls inside the Marshall Chain. One was Eniwetok Atoll, to the west. The other was Bikini Atoll. The first test, called Operation Crossroads Able, was detonated above the lagoon on July 1st, 1946. The second test, called Operation Crossroads Baker, was detonated underwater in the lagoon on July 25th, 1946. The Baker test was the first time a nuclear weapon was ever detonated underwater. It produced a distinctive mushroom cloud rising from the surface of the lagoon, photographed extensively by the United States military, and the shape of that cloud has been replicated in nearly every explosion the show has ever animated. The photograph of the Baker detonation became one of the most reproduced images of the early nuclear era. The shape of the cloud became the visual shorthand for nuclear destruction itself. The testing continued for over a decade. 23 separate detonations were conducted at Bikini Atoll between 1946 and 1958. The largest of the tests was Castle Bravo, detonated on March 1st, 1954. The Bravo blast was approximately 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It vaporized 3 islands. It contaminated the surrounding ocean for hundreds of miles. The radioactive fallout reached as far as Japan, where it sickened the crew of a fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon 5. The blast was, by any measure, one of the most environmentally destructive single events in human history. The reef beneath Bikini Atoll, the same reef where the modern Bikini Bottom is supposedly located, absorbed the full force of the underwater detonations and the contamination that followed. The contamination did not fade quickly. Even today, more than 70 years after the last test was conducted, the radiation levels in the soil and the surrounding waters remain elevated above the global background. The human cost of the testing is the part of the history that the SpongeBob universe never directly acknowledges, even though it is the foundation on which the entire universe is built. In 1946, the United States government removed the indigenous population of Bikini, which numbered 167 people, and relocated them to a smaller atoll called Rongerik. The Bikinians experienced starvation almost immediately because Rongerik did not have the food crops they needed to survive. They were moved again and again. In the 1970s, the United States government returned nearly 200 Bikinians to their home islands, but the people had to be removed again in 1978 because they were found to have ingested more radioactive cesium from the environment than any known human population in history. The Bikini people are now, in the present day, exiles. They have never returned to their original homeland permanently. The land is still considered too contaminated for safe, long-term habitation. Every March 1st, the Marshall Islands hold a National Day of Remembrance for the people who lost their homes to the testing. This is the place that Steven Hillenburg chose in 1997 to name his children's cartoon after. He could have made up any name. He could have invented an underwater geography of his own. He chose a real one, a famous one, and one with a very specific dark history that he, as a marine biologist, would have known about in detail. The choice was not accidental. According to Mr. Lawrence, in the 2024 Esquire interview, the connection was always part of the design. The voice actor, Roger Bumpus, who plays Squidward, brought up the long-running fan theory that Bikini Bottom was related to the atomic testing at Bikini Atoll. Bumpus said he had been telling fans for years that the theory was not true. Mr. Lawrence, sitting next to him, immediately corrected him. The exchange was recorded on video and circulated widely on the internet within days. The theory that fans had been articulating for nearly a decade was suddenly, after years of official non-acknowledgement, on the record. The exchange, recorded on video, is short and direct. Mr. Lawrence said that yes, the connection was true, and that it was part of the fun of designing the show. Then he said something that pushed the implications even further. He said that in the very first season, the writers had asked themselves how far they were going to take the concept. He said that the original idea was that the whole world was dead, except for Bikini Bottom. Bill Fagerbach, who plays Patrick, asked whether the muffler-shaped houses were part of that concept. Mr. Lawrence said yes. The world upstairs, he said, was gone, and Bikini Bottom was what was left. The implications of those few sentences reshaped the way every previous episode of the show can be read. The cheerful sponge in the cheerful pineapple house is, by the original concept, a survivor of the end of the world. The implications of what Mr. Lawrence confirmed are enormous. According to the original concept of the show, Bikini Bottom is a post-apocalyptic city. The surface world has been destroyed by nuclear war. The fish, sea sponges, starfish, crabs, and octopuses who live at the bottom of the ocean have been mutated by the radiation into anthropomorphic creatures who can talk, walk, work, and build houses out of the wreckage of the world above. The mufflers that make up so many of the homes are car parts that fell from the surface after civilization ended. The diving helmets used as mailboxes belonged to humans who died long ago. The anchors used as lampposts came from ships that sank when the world ended. The reason fire works underwater is because the radiation broke the rules of physics in this region of the sea. The reason a sea sponge can talk and a starfish can attend boating school is because the genetic structure of every species in the area has been permanently altered. This explains, retroactively, a number of design choices that previously seemed like random comedy. The shape of every explosion in the show is a mushroom cloud. The mushroom cloud is the visual signature of a nuclear blast. Every time something blows up in Bikini Bottom, from the ovens of the Krusty Krab to Plankton's failed inventions, the explosion takes the shape of a hydrogen bomb. Fans noticed this for years before the connection was confirmed. The episode Dying for Pie from season 2 has an explosion that closely resembles a real photograph of the Baker test. The shape is the same, the composition is the same. The only difference is that the show's version is animated and bright and cheerful, where the real photograph is grainy and black and white and historical. The visual repetition is too consistent to be accidental. Hillenberg, a marine biologist who would have studied the effects of the testing on the surrounding ecosystem, was clearly drawing the explosions deliberately. The architectural details of the city carry the same weight. The mufflers, the anchors, the fire hydrants made from oxygen tanks, the mailboxes built from old diving helmets. All of it points to a city built from the wreckage of human civilization. The species that survived the apocalypse used what they could find. They settled into the debris that fell from the surface. They made homes inside car parts and ship parts and pieces of equipment that no longer had any owners. The city, by the time the modern era of the show begins, is fully built and fully inhabited, and the residents have no memory of where any of the materials came from. The mufflers are just houses to them. The anchors are just lampposts. The history of the wreckage has been forgotten by the species that now lives inside it. The bombs, in the timeline of the show, fell while the species in the shallow reef were already beginning to stir. The pirate era had ended. The species had been slowly developing intelligence for several decades. The radiation accelerated everything. What might have taken another few thousand years of slow evolution happened instead over the course of a few decades. By the late 1940s, the first generation of fully modern Bikini Bottom residents was being born. By the 1950s, they were children. By the 1960s, they were teenagers. By the 1970s, they were adults, building the first version of the modern city. The transformation, by human evolutionary standards, was almost instantaneous. A species that had spent hundreds of millions of years living as ordinary marine animals became, within 3 or 4 generations, a fully modern, intelligent civilization. The two main characters whose canonical birth dates fall directly inside this window are Mr. Krabs and Plankton. Both of them were born on November 30th, 1942, in the same hospital, according to canon revealed in the season 5 premiere, Friend or Foe. The 1942 birth date is significant. It places their early childhoods directly inside the years when the bombs were falling. They were not born from the radiation. They were born just before it. But their formative years, the years when their personalities and their physical development were being shaped, were the years when the entire region of the ocean was being saturated with nuclear contamination. Whatever they became as adults, they became under the influence of those years. The greed, the bitterness, the obsessive determination, all of it was forged in the radioactive water of the post-war Pacific. The flashbacks in Friend or Foe show the two of them as small children playing together, going to school, getting bullied. The visual setting of those flashbacks is impossible to date precisely, but the implication is that they grew up in the late 1940s and 1950s, the exact years when the testing was at its peak. The Hangout, where they were rejected as children, a fast food joint called Stinky Burgers, located on top of a literal landfill, is the kind of post-war establishment that would have existed in any small American town in that period. The cultural details of the flashbacks, the clothing, the music in the background, the way the adults around them speak, all suggest a mid-20th century setting. The two of them are children of the bomb era in every sense. Their entire generation was the first to be born into the new, mutated reality of Bikini Bottom, and they grew up surrounded by other children who were, like them, the products of the same radioactive transformation. Mr. Krabs' later war service, the conflict the show has never named directly, almost certainly takes place during the Vietnam War era of the 1960s and early 1970s. He came back from that war, suffering from what the Krusty Krab training video describes as a deep depression that seemed endless. He stayed in his darkened room. He drank. He slowly recovered. By the time he bought the abandoned retirement home that would become the Krusty Krab, he was probably in his late 30s or early 40s, which would place the founding of the restaurant somewhere in the late 1970s or early 1980s. The Krusty Krab, in this reading, is a product of the post-Vietnam era, built by a veteran who was trying to find a purpose after the war. The restaurant is, in many ways, a coping mechanism. It gave Mr. Krabs something to organize his life around. It gave him a kitchen to run, a crew to manage, a daily routine to follow. It saved him from the depression that the war had left him with. Plankton, during the same years, was building his own life on the other side of the dump. He had taken his half of the torn recipe and opened the chum bucket. He had built Karen out of a calculator and a potato. He had begun his decades-long campaign to steal the Krabby Patty formula back from his former best friend. The bomb era had ended by this point. The radiation had done its work. The species was now fully modern, and the modern city was beginning to take its current shape. Plankton's life, like Mr. Krabs's, was a product of the new world that the bombs had created. He was scientifically gifted because the radiation had accelerated his species' intelligence. He was bitter and lonely because the bullying he experienced as a child had shaped his personality during the same years when the bombs were falling. He was who he was because of when and where he was born. The bombs, in the end, are the hinge on which the entire timeline turns. Everything before them is prehistory, the long, quiet stretch, and the slow buildup of the pirate era. Everything after them is the modern world. The exact year the modern era begins is hard to pin down, but somewhere between the early 1950s and the late 1960s, Bikini Bottom became Bikini Bottom. The reef had absorbed the bombs. The species had been transformed. The city was about to begin. The cheerful surface and the dark interior of Bikini Bottom were both established during this single era. The cheerfulness came from the species' new capacity for joy and friendship and creativity. The darkness came from the foundation the cheerfulness was built on, a foundation made of nuclear contamination and the wreckage of a world that had ended before any of the modern characters were born. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The bombs created the modern era and the species that would populate it. The next generation grew up in a city that was still finding its shape. In the next section, we walk through the post-bomb decades, the founding of the Krusty Krab, and the long childhoods of the characters who would become the modern cast. Section 5, the post-bomb decades, and the long childhoods of the cast. The decades between the end of the nuclear testing in 1958 and the beginning of the modern Bikini Bottom narrative are the years when the present-day cast grew up. Most of the main characters were children or young adults during this period. The city around them was being built in real time. The Krusty Krab was about to be founded. The chum bucket was about to open. The friendships, the rivalries, the marriages, and the broken recipes that would define the modern show were all being established during this window. The era runs roughly from the late 1950s through the late 1980s, with the early 1990s as the transition into the modern present-day setting. The era is, in many ways, the slow-motion construction of the entire universe the show would eventually depict. The earliest piece of canon from this era is the childhood of Mr. Krabs and Plankton. The two of them, born in 1942, would have been teenagers in the late 1950s and young adults in the 1960s. Their famous fight over the recipe, depicted in Friend or Foe, almost certainly takes place in their teen years, which would place it sometime in the early 1960s. The dump where they fought, the local hangout that turned into Stinky Burgers, the early Plabs Burgers experiment, all of it is set in this window. The recipe that would eventually become the Krabby Patty was created by accident during a fight between two teenagers in a landfill in the 1960s. That That single moment is the founding event of the modern economy of Bikini Bottom. Everything the city would eventually build around the Krusty Krab traces back to two boys tearing a piece of paper in half while a shelf of unrelated ingredients fell into a vat behind them. After the fight, the two of them went their separate ways. Plankton stayed in town, started building Karen out of his calculator collection, and slowly began the work that would eventually become the Chum Bucket. Mr. Krabs joined the Navy. The exact dates of his service are not given, but the visual cues in episodes like Shell of a Man and the Krusty Krab training video suggest that he served during the Vietnam War, somewhere between 1965 and 1975. He came back from the war traumatized. The Krusty Krab training video shows him alone in a darkened room with a bottle next to him, slowly recovering from what the narrator describes as a deep depression that seemed endless. The recovery took years. By the time he was ready to start a business, the war was over, the country was changing, and he was approaching middle age. His Navy years had given him cooking skills, leadership experience, and a network of fellow veterans who would, in some episodes, return to visit him decades later. The Krusty Krab itself was founded somewhere in the late 1970s or early 1980s. The exact date is not given. The episode that establishes the founding, the Krusty Krab training video, presents the history as a kind of corporate orientation tape, but does not specify the year. What it does establish is that the building was originally a retirement home that had gone bankrupt long before Mr. Krabs ever bought it. The structure was abandoned, the roof was leaking, the windows were broken. Mr. Krabs purchased it cheaply, possibly with the small fortune he had accumulated from selling his old pirate ship. He cleaned it out, he painted it, he repurposed the rooms into a kitchen, a dining area, and a small office for himself. He hung a sign, he printed menus, he opened the doors. The first customers, according to the training video, were slow to arrive. The neighborhood did not know what to make of a fast food restaurant run by a former Navy crab in the body of an old retirement home. The early years were lean. The Chum Bucket opened around the same time, directly across the street. Plankton had been preparing for years. He had built the building inside the body of an actual metal bucket, with a giant arm on the roof that gave the place its distinctive silhouette. He had set up his laboratory in the back. He had finished the development of Karen, who, by this point, was a full, waterproof supercomputer with a wall-mounted monitor and the ability to converse with Plankton as a peer. He opened the restaurant with great fanfare. He sold his first chum patty. The customer, whoever it was, took one bite and never returned. The Chum Bucket has, in its entire history of operation, never had more than a handful of customers, and most of those customers came in by mistake. The failure was immediate and total, and the failure has continued, in roughly the same form, for the entire run of the show. While the two restaurants were being founded, the rest of the modern cast was being born. SpongeBob's exact birth date is given in canon as July 14th, 1986, according to the SpongeBob SquarePants trivia book and the show's Bible. That birth date places his childhood in the late 1980s and his young adulthood in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which is when the show begins. His parents, Harold and Margaret SquarePants, met somewhere in the years before his birth and have been raising him in a small house outside the main city ever since. The Pineapple at 124 Conch Street is, in canonical terms, the home he moved into as a young adult, not the home he grew up in. His childhood was spent in his parents' house, somewhere in the suburbs of Bikini Bottom, in a setting the show has only briefly depicted in flashbacks. The flashbacks suggest a quiet, loving household, with parents who supported his interests and never pushed him to do anything other than what made him happy. Patrick Star was born around the same time as SpongeBob. The two of them have been best friends since they were infants, according to a flashback in the episode The Secret Box, which shows them as babies in a hospital nursery, lying in adjacent cribs and immediately recognizing each other. The flashback parallels the Mr. Krabs and Plankton flashback in Friend or Foe almost exactly, with two infants placed next to each other and forming a friendship that would last their entire lives. The implication is that the timeline of Bikini Bottom keeps repeating this same pattern. Two infants meet in a hospital. They become friends. They grow up together. Some of them stay friends forever, like SpongeBob and Patrick. Some of them end up tearing a recipe in half in a landfill and never speaking again, like Mr. Krabs and Plankton. The pattern is the same. The outcomes diverge. Squidward Tentacles is older than SpongeBob and Patrick. His exact age is not given in canon, but the visual cues and the references to his past suggest that he was born somewhere in the late 1960s or early 1970s, which would make him a generation older than the sponges and starfish around him. He attended music school in his youth and trained trained as a clarinetist. He had ambitions of becoming a professional musician. His ambitions were never realized. By the time the modern era of the show begins, he has been working at the Krusty Krab as a cashier for years, possibly decades, and his musical dreams have curdled into resentment. The episode Band Geeks reveals that Squidward had a high school rival, a square-headed octopus named Squilliam Fancyson, who went on to become a successful musician, while Squidward sank into the routine of fast food work. The rivalry is one of the longest-running emotional threads in the series, and it shapes much of Squidward's behavior in the modern era. Sandy Cheeks arrived in Bikini Bottom from Texas at some point in the late 1990s, just before the events of the show begin. She came on assignment from her employers, the trio of upper-class chimpanzees who run Tree Dome Enterprises. She built her glass dome at 126 Conch Street and moved in with her oak tree and her hamster wheel and her astronaut suit. The exact year of her arrival is not given, but she has been in Bikini Bottom for at least a few years by the time the pilot episode airs, since she has already established herself as a known scientist in the city by the time SpongeBob meets her in Tea at the Tree Dome. Her arrival represents the first major outsider integration in the modern city. Bikini Bottom had, until her arrival, been populated almost entirely by the descendants of the original mutated species. Sandy was the first character from the surface world to settle there permanently, and her presence opened the city to a kind of cultural exchange it had not previously known. Mrs. Puff arrived in Bikini Bottom even earlier. Her boating school has been operating for years by the time the show begins. Her husband, Mr. Puff, was caught by humans on the surface and turned into a novelty light bulb cover for a lamp at some point before the show begins. The grief from that loss is part of why she has built her quiet life teaching boating school under a name that, according to the episode No Free Rides, is not even her real name. She changed it at some point to escape a previous life. The implication is that she came to Bikini Bottom as a fugitive, possibly in the 1980s, and has been hiding in plain sight ever since. Whatever she was before she became Mrs. Puff is not specified in canon, but the fact that she has built an entire new identity for herself suggests that the previous one was not safe to keep. Pearl Krabs was born somewhere in the early 1990s, which would make her a teenager by the time the modern show begins. Her mother, the never-seen Mrs. Krabs, was present for her birth and her early childhood, but disappeared at some point before the show's narrative starts. The exact circumstances of the disappearance are the canonical mystery that Steven Hillenburg refused to ever explain. Pearl, in the modern era, is being raised by Mr. Krabs alone. The relationship between the two of them is one of the most tender pieces of writing in the show, and the absence of the mother is one of the heaviest. Mr. Krabs has been doing all of the parenting himself for at least a decade by the time the show begins, and Pearl has grown up in the apartment above the Krusty Krab as an only child of a widower or something father. The grief in the household has been present for her entire life, even though she has never been told what caused it. The post-bomb decades also produced the supporting cast that would, by the time the show began, populate the city around the main characters. Larry the Lobster grew up during this period. Old Man Jenkins, despite appearing elderly in every episode, would have lived through these decades as well, possibly as a younger version of himself. The Bikini Bottom News Network was being established, with the early version of Perch Perkins beginning his career as a young reporter. The schools, the hospitals, the police force, and the other civic institutions of the modern city were all being built during these years. The infrastructure that the modern show would treat as background was, during the post-bomb decades, being constructed by the first fully modern generation. By the late 1990s, the modern cast was assembled. Mr. Krabs was running the Krusty Krab. Plankton was running the Chum Bucket. Squidward was working as a cashier. Pearl was a teenager. Sandy had arrived from Texas. Mrs. Puff was teaching boating school. The city was fully built. The restaurants were established. The neighborhoods were laid out. The only thing missing was the cheerful young sponge who would, on May 1st, 1999, walk into the Krusty Krab for a job interview and change everything. The post-bomb decades had been the long preparation. The modern era was about to begin. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The post-bomb decades built the city and raised the cast. By the late 1990s, everything was in place except for the cheerful sponge who would tie it all together. In the next section, we walk through May 1st, 1999, the founding episode, and the first 3 years of the modern Bikini Bottom we know. Section 6, May 1st, 1999, and the first era of the modern show. The modern era of Bikini Bottom, in the canonical timeline of the show, begins on a single specific day. The date is left vague within the show itself, but in the real-world production timeline, it corresponds to May 1st, 1999, the night the pilot episode aired on Nickelodeon as a sneak peek after the Kids' Choice Awards. The pilot consisted of 3 short segments that introduced the city, the main character, his neighbors, his job, his pet, and his new friend. By the end of the night, the entire universe that the show would spend the next 25 years building had been established in rough form, and the modern era of Bikini Bottom had officially begun. The first segment of the pilot was Help Wanted. It opens with the French narrator introducing the audience to the city of Bikini Bottom, located beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The camera moves through the streets, past the muffler houses and the anchor lampposts, and arrives at a pineapple-shaped home where a young yellow sponge is waking up to start his day. SpongeBob, as he introduces himself, is a fry cook in training. He has been waiting his whole life to work at the Krusty Krab. Today is the day he plans to apply for a job. The episode follows him through the application process, through Mr. Krabs' reluctance to hire him, through a sudden rush of customers that gives SpongeBob the chance to prove himself, and through his eventual triumph as the Krusty Krab's official fry cook. The episode establishes a number of foundational pieces of canon. The Krusty Krab is shown for the first time, with Squidward sitting at the cash register and Mr. Krabs running the back office. The boatmobile is introduced as the city's primary form of transportation. The Krabby Patty is shown being made for the first time, although the secret formula is not revealed. The cooking process involves a grill, a spatula, and a series of carefully timed flips that SpongeBob performs at superhuman speed. By the end of the episode, the Krusty Krab has its fry cook, and the central economic engine of the show has been activated. The second segment of the pilot was Reef Blowers. It is the shortest of the 3, lasting only a few minutes, and it has almost no dialogue. SpongeBob is in his front yard with a leaf blower style device, trying to clean up the kelp and debris that has settled on his lawn. Squidward, next door, is trying to relax. The device makes noise. Squidward gets annoyed. SpongeBob continues. The segment ends with a comedic disaster that destroys both yards. The episode establishes the dynamic between SpongeBob and Squidward that would define their relationship for the next 25 years. SpongeBob is enthusiastic and oblivious. Squidward is exhausted and resentful. The two of them live next to each other, and they will, for the rest of the show, be unable to escape each other. The third segment of the pilot was Tea at the Tree Dome. This is the segment that introduces Sandy Cheeks. SpongeBob, walking home from work, encounters Sandy wrestling a giant clam. The clam tries to eat her. SpongeBob tries to help. He gets eaten in the process. Sandy rescues him, and the two of them become friends. She invites him back to her home, which turns out to be a glass dome filled with air sitting at the bottom of the ocean. SpongeBob, being a sea sponge, immediately begins to dehydrate. The episode follows his attempts to maintain his dignity while slowly drying out, until Patrick comes to rescue him with a goldfish bowl full of water. The episode introduces Sandy as the only main character in the show who is not actually an ocean creature, and it establishes the physics of her dome, which will remain consistent for the rest of the series. After the pilot aired, the show went into regular production. The first season ran from 1999 to 2001 and consisted of 41 episodes. During that season, almost every major piece of the modern Bikini Bottom canon was established. The Chum Bucket was introduced in the episode Plankton, which aired on July 31st, 1999. Plankton himself was introduced as the show's primary villain, a tiny green copepod with a permanent grudge against Mr. Krabs and an obsessive desire to steal the Krabby Patty formula. Karen was introduced as Plankton's computer wife, although her role would be expanded in later seasons. The Patty formula's secret status was established as a permanent plot device. Mrs. Puff and her boating school were introduced in the episode Boating School, which aired on August 7th, 1999. The episode established that SpongeBob, as a working adult, attends Mrs. Puff's class on the side because he has been unable to pass his boating license test. The setup is, in the show's internal logic, a compromise that Steven Hillenburg made with Nickelodeon executives. The executives wanted SpongeBob to be a child who went to school. Hillenburg wanted SpongeBob to be an adult. The compromise was Mrs. Puff's class, which functions as a permanent driver's education that SpongeBob can never quite complete. The setup has remained a running joke for the entire run of the series. Pearl was introduced in the episode Squeaky Boots, which aired on September 4th, 1999. The episode established her as Mr. Krabs' teenage daughter, depicted as extraordinarily tall and heavy because she is a sperm whale. Her introduction introduction immediately raised the question that Steven Hillenburg refused to ever answer. How does a crab have a whale daughter? The show, in its first season, simply presented the relationship as fact and moved on. The mother was already absent. The mystery was already in place. The audience accepted it. The Flying Dutchman was introduced in the episode SquarePants, which aired on October 28, 1999, as the show's first Halloween special. He was presented as the most powerful supernatural being in the ocean, the ghost of a pirate who had died at sea long before the modern city existed. The introduction immediately established the canonical existence of the supernatural in the SpongeBob universe. Ghosts were real. King Neptune, who would be introduced later, was real. The world contained mystical forces that the everyday characters had to contend with. The introduction of the Dutchman in the first season set the tone for the entire mythology that would build up around him over the next 2 decades. Larry the Lobster was introduced in the episode Ripped Pants, which aired on July 17, 1999. He was presented as the muscle-bound lifeguard at Goo Lagoon, the local beach. His introduction established the existence of Goo Lagoon as a recurring setting and gave the show a place to set beach episodes. Old Man Jenkins was introduced gradually across the first season as the recurring elderly resident who would, over the next 25 years, become a kind of running gag in his own right. He would die and come back to life multiple times across the series, with the show treating his repeated reappearances as a comedic device that nobody ever questioned. By the end of the first season, the modern Bikini Bottom was fully established. The cast was complete, the locations were mapped, the relationships were defined. The first feature film, which Hillenburg intended to be the proper ending of the series, was already in development. The show had become, in a single year, one of the most popular animated series on television. The episodes were being watched by millions of viewers. The merchandise was beginning to appear in stores. The cultural footprint of the show was expanding rapidly. The cheerful yellow sponge had, in less than 2 years, become one of the most recognizable cartoon characters in the world. The second and third seasons, which ran from 2000 to 2004, deepened the canon without fundamentally changing it. The Patty Vault was introduced in Just One Bite. The Krusty Krab training video aired in May 2002 and established the dark backstory of the building. The friendship between Mr. Krabs and Plankton was finally explained in Friend or Foe in 2007, although the groundwork for that explanation had been laid throughout the first 3 seasons. The first feature film was released in November 2004, and Hillenburg stepped back from showrunner duties to focus on it. The first era of the modern show ended with the release of that film, and the next era began with Hillenburg's departure. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first 3 years built the modern world, and the first feature film closed it out. Hillenburg believed the story was over. The show kept going without him. In the next section, we walk through the post-Hillenburg era, the long middle of the show's run, and the years when Bikini Bottom became something its creator had not planned for. Section 7, the post-Hillenburg era and the long middle of the show. When the first feature film was released in November 2004, Steven Hillenburg believed the story of SpongeBob SquarePants was over. He had built the universe, run it for 3 seasons, and given it a proper ending in a theatrical movie. The film concluded with SpongeBob and his friends saving Bikini Bottom from a crisis caused by Plankton, with David Hasselhoff carrying the heroes back to the city on his back, and with the central characters celebrating a victory that, in Hillenburg's mind, was the natural stopping point of the series. He was ready to move on. He stepped back from his role as showrunner and turned his attention to other projects, including a small surfing-themed film called Hello, Bikini Bottom, and an animated short he had been developing on the side. He assumed Nickelodeon would let the show end gracefully. Nickelodeon had other plans. The show kept going. The 4th season began airing in May 2005, 6 months after the feature film was released. The new showrunner, a writer named Paul Tibbitt, who had been with the show since the first season, took over the day-to-day production. Hillenburg remained involved as an executive producer, but the creative direction of the series shifted away from him. He gave notes when asked. He approved major story decisions. He did not write episodes. He did not run the writing room. The new era, which would last from 2005 through about 2012, is the longest single creative period in the show's history. It produced more than 100 episodes. It introduced new locations, new characters, and new running jokes. It also produced some of the most controversial episodes in the show's run, including the 2 suicide-themed episodes that the fanbase has been arguing about ever since. The era is, by any reasonable measure, the most divisive stretch of the entire series. The fourth season, which aired from 2005 to 2007, was a transitional period. The episodes were still recognizably the show that Hillenburg had built, but the tone was beginning to shift. The episodes were getting longer, the plots were getting more elaborate, the characters were beginning to behave in ways that did not always match their established canon. Mr. Krabs' greed, which had been a comedic personality trait in the first 3 seasons, started to tip into something darker. He began making decisions that put other characters in danger. He began treating Plankton with a level of cruelty that the early seasons had never depicted. The shift was gradual, but it was visible to attentive viewers. The fan base has, in retrospect, identified the 4th season as the beginning of what some longtime viewers call the modern era of the show, which they distinguish sharply from the original Hillenburg-led era of the first 3 seasons. The visual style of the show also began to shift during this period, with character designs becoming slightly sharper, expressions becoming more exaggerated, and animation becoming more reliant on digital tools that allowed for faster turnaround between episodes. The 5th season, which aired in 2007 and 2008, included the episode that would, in canonical terms, become the most important piece of backstory the show ever produced. Friend or Foe, the season premiere, aired on April 13, 2007. The episode is a long flashback that explains, for the first time, how Mr. Krabs and Plankton became enemies. It establishes their shared birthday, their childhood friendship, the bullies who tormented them, the dump where they tried to start their first restaurant, the poisoned patty that killed Old Man Jenkins, and the moment they tore the original recipe in half during a fight. The episode is one of the most emotionally weighted pieces of writing the show has ever produced, and it answered a question that the fanbase had been asking for nearly a decade. It also marked the beginning of a phase where the show became more comfortable with serialized backstory, with characters having pasts that mattered, and with emotional weight that lingered between episodes. The flashback structure, which the early seasons had used only sparingly, became a more common storytelling device. Episodes began referencing events from earlier episodes. Characters began developing histories that built on each other across multiple appearances. The show, which had begun as a series of standalone comedic shorts, was slowly becoming something that resembled a continuous narrative. The 6th season, which aired from 2008 to 2010, included one of the 2 most controversial episodes in the entire run of the show. One Course Meal aired on November 14, 2010. The episode is built around Mr. Krabs' discovery that Plankton is afraid of whales. He uses the information to dress up as Pearl, his own daughter, and torment Plankton with the threat of being eaten. The torment continues for what the episode implies is several days. Plankton becomes increasingly paranoid. He stops eating. He stops sleeping. He boards up the windows of the chum bucket. He hides under his lab equipment. The cumulative weight of the harassment slowly breaks him down. By the end of the episode, Plankton has reached a place that the show treats with disturbing calm. He walks into the middle of a road. He lies down on the asphalt. He waits for a bus to hit him. SpongeBob, the only character in the episode who treats the moment as serious, talks him out of it. The episode resolves with Plankton being scared away from the Krusty Krab again, with Mr. Krabs facing no real consequences for his actions, and with the audience left to process what they had just watched. The episode generated immediate backlash from the fanbase, with thousands of fans signing a petition asking Nickelodeon to remove it from rotation. The petition was not honored. The episode is still in the catalog as of the present day. The arguments against the episode have been articulated repeatedly across the years. The torment depicted is not played for comedy in any sustainable way. Plankton, who has spent the entire run of the show as a comedic antagonist, is depicted in this episode as a victim of bullying that pushes him into a severe emotional breakdown. Mr. Krabs, who has spent the entire run of the show as a flawed but ultimately sympathetic character, is depicted in this episode as someone capable of genuine cruelty. The dynamic that the show had spent 11 years building between the 2 characters is, in this single episode, transformed into something much darker than anything the early seasons had ever suggested. The fanbase has never quite recovered from the shift. Many longtime viewers consider One Course Meal to be one of the worst episodes the show has ever produced. Others consider it a brave piece of writing that engages with darker emotional territory than children's animation usually allows. The arguments continue. The 7th and 8th seasons, which aired from 2009 through 2013, continued the trend toward darker comedic territory. Are You Happy Now?, which aired on March 31st, 2012, is the second of the two suicide-themed episodes. The episode follows Squidward as he discovers that he has no happy memories. SpongeBob attempts to create one for him, leading to a series of failed and increasingly painful attempts. By the middle of the episode, Squidward has fallen into a deep depression. The animation slows, the colors desaturate. He sits in his living room without moving for what the episode implies is days. The visual register of the episode in this stretch is unlike anything else in the show's history. The bright, fast-paced cheerfulness that defines most SpongeBob episodes is replaced by something quiet and almost meditative. The audience watches Squidward not move, not speak, not eat for several minutes of screen time. The depression is depicted with surprising medical accuracy. Then comes the first of two scenes that earned the episode its reputation. Squidward kneels in front of his oven and lowers his head toward it. The framing strongly implies a dangerous situation. The show holds the shot. The audience is given several seconds to absorb what they are watching. Then Squidward pulls a tray of brownies out of the oven. The bait and switch is over. A few minutes later, he ties what appears to be a rope over a ceiling beam and pulls it tight. The camera pulls back to reveal that he is hoisting up a bird cage. The bait and switch is over again. The episode resolves with SpongeBob throwing Squidward a party at the Krusty Krab, where every guest is a papier-mâché replica of SpongeBob himself. Squidward, in the resolution, finds his happiness in violently destroying every replica with a baseball bat. The implication that Squidward's only happy memory is the symbolic destruction of his coworker is left for the audience to process on their own. The episode does not address it. The show moves on. The two episodes have been criticized continuously since they first aired. The arguments have been the same for over a decade. The bait and switch distress gags use imagery of dangerous situations as a comedic punchline. The torment of plankton normalizes bullying to the point of emotional collapse. The resolutions of both episodes preserve the status quo without acknowledging the weight of what was depicted. The fanbase has never reached a consensus on whether the episodes should still be in rotation. The network has never removed them. They sit in the catalog alongside the cheerful early episodes as a reminder that the long middle of the show was sometimes capable of producing material that the early seasons would never have considered. The two episodes are, in many ways, the high watermark of the post-Hillenburg era's willingness to push past the comedic boundaries that Hillenburg himself had carefully maintained. The post-Hillenburg era also included the second feature film, Sponge Out of Water, which was released in February 2015. Hillenburg returned to write the story for the film, which marked his first major creative involvement in the show since 2004. The film follows SpongeBob and his friends as they travel to the surface world to recover the stolen Krabby Patty formula, eventually transforming into superhero versions of themselves to defeat the pirate Burger Beard. The film was successful at the box office, earning over $300 million worldwide, and its success prompted Nickelodeon to bring Hillenburg back as the showrunner of the series itself. The 9th season, which began airing in October 2016, was the first under his renewed leadership. The tone of the show shifted again. The dark comedy of the post-Hillenburg years gave way to something closer to the cheerful warmth of the original 3 seasons. The characters softened, the plots became simpler. The emotional weight that had built up during the long middle was, in many cases, gently set aside. The show began, slowly, to feel like itself again. The return did not last long. In March 2017, Hillenburg announced that he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the degenerative motor neuron disease that would eventually take his life. The diagnosis was a shock to everyone involved with the show. ALS is a rapidly progressive disease that, in most cases, takes its victims within 2 to 5 years of diagnosis. Hillenburg was 55 at the time of the announcement. He continued to work on the show as long as he was physically able. He participated in the writing room. He approved scripts. He gave notes on storyboards. He worked through his diagnosis with the same quiet determination he had brought to every project of his life. He attended fewer meetings as his physical condition declined. He communicated through writing when speaking became difficult. He continued making creative decisions for the show as long as he was capable of making them. He died on November 26, 2018, at his home in San Marino, California, at the age of 57. The cause of death was complications from ALS. The announcement was made by Nickelodeon the following day. The cast and crew, many of whom had worked with him for 2 decades, decades were devastated. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, gave a tearful interview in which he described Hillenburg as a brilliant and gentle man who had created a world that would outlive all of them. Bill Fagerbach, the voice of Patrick, said that Hillenburg had been the kindest collaborator he had ever worked with. Roger Bumpus, the voice of Squidward, said that Hillenburg had treated everyone on the production with the same warmth and respect, regardless of their role. The cast and crew gathered for a private memorial. His ashes were sprinkled off the coast of Los Angeles County, returned to the ocean he had spent his whole life loving. The show continued without him. It has been continuing without him ever since. The post-Hillenburg era also produced two new locations that have since become permanent parts of the canon. The first was the Bikini Bottom Mall, which gave the show a new setting for episodes involving Pearl and her teenage friends. The mall is a multi-level shopping complex with dozens of stores, food courts, and entertainment venues. Pearl works at a clothing store called Daisy's Organic Roots in some episodes, and a candy store in others. The mall has become a recurring setting for shopping episodes, mall rat episodes, and teenage drama episodes. The introduction of the mall expanded the world of Bikini Bottom in a direction the early seasons had not explored. The first 3 seasons had focused almost entirely on the Krusty Krab and the immediate neighborhood around Conch Street. The mall opened up the suburbs and the commercial districts and gave the show a new place to set episodes that did not involve the patty flipping routine that had defined the early years. The second new location was the deeper development of the Bikini Bottom News Network, which has been hosted by the recurring character Perch Perkins for most of the show's run. Perch Perkins has appeared in dozens of episodes covering crises, celebrity events, weather emergencies, and food truck festivals. He has, by canonical accumulation, become one of the most recognized faces in the city. The news network gave the show a way to comment on its own events, to let the city react to the things that happened inside it, and to build the sense that Bikini Bottom was a real community where things mattered. Other recurring news personalities have been added over the years, including a weather reporter, a sports anchor, and a celebrity gossip correspondent. The network is, by the standards of children's animation, surprisingly fully realized. The long middle of the show is also when the supporting cast became deeply established. Bubble Bass, the demanding customer who hides a pickle under his tongue to falsely accuse the Krusty Krab of poor service, became a recurring villain who has appeared in episodes across multiple seasons, each time adding new layers to his obsessive feud with SpongeBob. The Tattletale Strangler, who stalks SpongeBob across an entire half hour, became one of the show's most memorable one-off antagonists, with his episode regularly appearing on best-of lists despite his never returning. Old Man Jenkins continued to die and come back to life with no explanation, with the show eventually treating his repeated reappearances as a kind of running gag that the audience was expected to simply accept without questioning. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, the elderly superhero duo who live at Shady Shoals Rest Home, were given their own recurring storylines, including episodes about their declining health, their long-running rivalries with their nemeses, and their reluctant retirement from active superhero work. The supporting cast filled in. The city, by the time Hillenburg returned in 2016, was populated with hundreds of named characters, each with their own small piece of canon, each contributing to the lived-in feeling of the world. Background fish that had appeared in the first season were now recognizable enough that fans could identify them by name in scenes where they had no dialogue. Recurring extras developed personalities through repeated small appearances. The city, in a sense, had grown larger than the writers themselves could fully track. The show's reference materials, including internal style guides and character bibles, became increasingly elaborate to keep the canon consistent. Some longtime fans began compiling their own reference documents, mapping out the relationships between minor characters in ways that the show itself had never explicitly stated. The era between 2004 and Hillenburg's death in 2018 was, in many ways, the era when Bikini Bottom became something larger than its creator. Hillenburg had built the foundation, but the long middle was when the world filled itself in. New writers added new layers. New directors found new visual styles. New voice actors joined the cast and made the supporting characters their own. The city expanded outward in every direction, and the canon became larger than any single person could fully track. By the time Hillenburg died, the show had become a collective creation, owned by everyone who had ever worked on it and everyone who had ever watched it. The cheerful sponge in the cheerful pineapple house was no longer the property of one marine biologist from Anaheim. He belonged, in some quiet way, to the entire culture. He had become a public figure. His city had become a public place. The transition from a single creator's vision to a collective creation is the defining shift of the long middle. Hillenburg's original concept, the post-apocalyptic, mutated reef city populated by anthropomorphic survivors of a nuclear war, had been the foundation. The long middle had built a recognizable, lived-in version of that city on top of the foundation, with shopping malls and news networks and recurring villains and elderly superhero duos. The show that audiences watched in 2018 was not the show that Hillenburg had pitched in 1997. It was something larger, looser, and more populated, with both the strengths and the weaknesses that come with that kind of expansion. The strengths were depth, familiarity, and a sense of community. The weaknesses were inconsistency, occasional tonal misfires, and the gradual erosion of some of the original vision's careful restraint. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The post-Hillenburg era expanded the world and ended with the loss of the man who built it. The show kept going, carrying his vision into a future he would never see. In the next section, we walk through the years after his death, the streaming era expansions, and the spin-off shows that would extend the timeline forward. Section 8, the years after Hillenburg and the streaming era expansion. The death of Stephen Hillenburg in November 2018 created an immediate question for everyone involved in the production of SpongeBob SquarePants. The show had been on the air for 19 years. The man who had created it was gone. The cast and crew were grieving. The decision about whether to continue the series and how to continue it without him fell to a small group of people who had worked closely with him for most of his career. The new showrunner was Vincent Waller, a longtime writer and director who had been with the show since the early seasons. The new director was Mark Ceccarelli, who had also been with the show for years. The two of them, working together, took over the daily production of the series and committed to continuing it in a way that would honor what Hillenburg had built. The years after his death have been the most expansive in the show's history. New episodes have continued to air. New feature films have been produced. New spin-off series have been developed. New merchandise has been released. New theme park attractions have been opened. The world of Bikini Bottom has expanded outward in every direction at a pace that even Hillenburg himself would have found surprising. Some of that expansion has been welcomed by the fan base. Some of it has been controversial. All of it has happened in the shadow of the man who is no longer there to approve or reject any of it. The first major post-death project was the third feature film, Sponge on the Run, which was released in 2020. The film had been in production for several years before Hillenburg's death, and he had been involved in early creative decisions. The plot follows SpongeBob and Patrick on a quest to rescue Gary, who has been kidnapped by King Poseidon and taken to the lost city of Atlantic City, the underwater equivalent of Las Vegas. The film also includes flashbacks to SpongeBob's childhood, depicting his time at a camp called Camp Coral, where he met Patrick, Squidward, and the other main characters as children. The flashbacks are the first time the show had ever depicted SpongeBob as a child in any extended way, and they raised immediate questions about the canon. The Camp Coral scenes contradicted earlier canon. In the original show, SpongeBob and Patrick had been established as friends since infancy, having met in a hospital nursery and recognized each other immediately. Camp Coral depicted them meeting as children at a summer camp, which is a different version of the same friendship. The fan base noticed the contradiction and argued about it for years. The eventual fan consensus was that Camp Coral was a separate continuity, a different version of the SpongeBob universe that exists in parallel to the original show, and that fans were free to choose which version they preferred. The contradiction has never been officially resolved. The Camp Coral scenes were popular enough that Nickelodeon developed them into a full spin-off series. Camp Coral, which premiered in March 2021, is set during the summer that SpongeBob, Patrick, and the others spent at the camp as children. The series depicts the main characters as 10-year-olds. They live in cabins, they go to swimming lessons, they sing camp songs, they get into mild adventures. The series ran for 2 seasons and produced nearly 40 episodes. It was the first major spin-off in the show's history and established that the Bikini Bottom universe could support multiple parallel series running simultaneously. The second spin-off was the Patrick Star Show, which premiered in July 2021. The series is presented as a fictional television show that Patrick hosts from his bedroom under his rock. He has guests, he performs sketches, he sings songs, he interviews celebrities. The conceit allows the show to depict surreal comedic scenarios that would not fit fit into the main series. Patrick interviews historical figures who could not possibly exist in the modern era. He hosts cooking segments with ingredients that defy physics. He breaks the fourth wall in ways that the main show would never permit. The series ran for 2 seasons and is, like Camp Coral, treated as a parallel continuity rather than a direct continuation of the main canon. The third spin-off, which was announced after Hillenburg's death and entered development in the early 2020s, is a series focused on Squidward called The Tales of SpongeBob. The series is, as of the present day, still in development. The exact format has not been finalized, but the early reports suggest that it will explore Squidward's life in more depth than the main series ever did, with episodes focused on his music career, his relationships outside of his job, and his complex inner life. The series, when it eventually airs, will be the first spin-off built around a non-SpongeBob character. The fourth and most recent spin-off is the Plankton movie, which premiered on Netflix in 2025. The film, titled Plankton, the Movie, follows Plankton and Karen as their relationship reaches a breaking point after years of being underappreciated. Karen removes her own empathy chip and becomes a multi-headed war machine called Hydra Karen, who plans to conquer Bikini Bottom and then the world. Plankton has to team up with SpongeBob to stop her. The resolution involves Plankton acknowledging, for the first time in his adult life, that he has spent decades taking the woman he loves for granted. The film treats this with surprising emotional weight and has been well received by the fan base as one of the most thoughtful pieces of writing the franchise has produced in years. The post-death era has also produced a number of canonical clarifications about the universe. The most significant came in December 2024, when Mr. Lawrence appeared in an Esquire interview alongside the main cast and confirmed, for the first time on the record, that the post-apocalyptic origin of Bikini Bottom was indeed part of the show's original concept. The confirmation, which we covered in earlier sections of this video, was a major moment for the fanbase. A theory that had been circulating for nearly a decade was suddenly canon. The implications reached all the way back to the first episode and reshaped how many fans understood the entire series. The post-death era has also seen the show acknowledge the existence of its own dark fan culture in increasingly direct ways. The 2019 episode SpongeBob in Random Land included a direct reference to the famous Squidward's suicide creepypasta, with a brief shot of Squidward sitting in a dimly lit bedroom with red eyes. The reference was approved by Vincent Waller and the storyboard director Adam Paloyan and aired in the original cut of the episode before being censored in later airings. The acknowledgement marked the first time the show had ever directly referenced a piece of fan-made horror writing. The fanbase noticed immediately. The conversation between the show and its audience about how dark the show has always been allowed to be reached a new level of openness. The post-death era has not been without its controversies. The Wendy's Krabby Patty collab promotion in 2024, which featured the chain's signature beef burger marketed as a real-world Krabby Patty, generated significant fan backlash. Hillenburg, before his death, had been clear that the Krabby Patty was a vegetable-based burger and contained no meat at all. The Wendy's promotion contradicted that canon directly. Fans accused Nickelodeon of betraying Hillenburg's vision in pursuit of marketing dollars. The promotion went forward anyway. The criticism faded after a few months, but it left a lasting impression on the fanbase, who saw it as evidence that the show, in the post-Hillenburg era, was being managed by people who did not always share Hillenburg's principles. The streaming era expansion has, in general, been a mixed blessing. The fanbase has welcomed new content, but it has also worried about the dilution of the show's core identity. Hillenburg was famous for his hatred of merchandising and for his commitment to keeping the show focused on the simple pleasures of tide pool ecology. The streaming era has been the opposite of those values. The show has become a brand. The brand has become an empire. The empire has been generating revenue for Nickelodeon at a scale that Hillenburg, by every account, would have personally hated. The cheerful sponge in the cheerful pineapple house has been transformed, against the wishes of his creator, into a multi-billion-dollar franchise that is unlikely to ever stop expanding. By the present day, the SpongeBob universe consists of the original series, the 4 feature films, the 4 spin-off series, the dozens of video games, the Broadway musical, the theme park attractions, and the constant stream of new merchandise. The timeline of Bikini Bottom now extends not just through the present-day adventures of the main cast, but backward into the Camp Coral childhoods, sideways sideways into the Patrick Star Show parallel reality and outward into every commercial product the brand has been attached to. The world has gotten bigger than any single person could keep track of, and it continues to grow. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The streaming era has expanded the world far beyond what Hillenburg had built. The cheerful sponge has become an empire that even his creator could not have predicted. In the next section, we walk through the future eras of the timeline, the Chrome City of 2,000 years from now, and the strange, flickering glimpses the show has given us of what comes after. Section 9, the far future and the Chrome Towers of the year 4017. The same Season 1 episode that established the prehistoric past of Bikini Bottom also established its far future. SB-129, which aired on December 31st, 1999, is built around time travel, and Squidward's accidental journey takes him not just into the deep past, but also into the deep future. After being frozen in the Krusty Krab freezer for 2,000 years, he wakes up in a version of Bikini Bottom that is unrecognizable. The streets are made of chrome, the buildings are floating glass towers, the residents are robots. The sky is a kind of metallic green. Everything is sleek, geometric, and emotionless. The cheerful, organic city of the present day has been replaced, somewhere across the centuries, by something fundamentally different. The exact year of the future Bikini Bottom is given by simple addition. SB-129 takes place in 1999, and Squidward is frozen for 2,000 years, which means he wakes up in the year 3999. Some fans have argued that the year should be 4017, accounting for the time that has passed in the modern era of the show. But the math is not particularly important. The point is that the city has, somewhere across the next 2 millennia, transformed itself into a chrome and glass civilization that no longer resembles the muffler-shaped neighborhoods of the present. The transformation is total. There is no trace of the organic city left. The pineapple house is gone. The Moai head is gone. The boatmobiles are gone. Everything that defined the visual language of the modern Bikini Bottom has been replaced by something cold and geometric. The Chrome City has its own residents. The robotic versions of SpongeBob and Patrick that Squidward briefly meets are, in the show's logic, descendants of the modern characters. They have been engineered, somewhere across the centuries, into mechanical beings that no longer require organic bodies. They have the same general silhouettes as their ancestors. The robotic SpongeBob is square and yellow. The robotic Patrick is pink and shaped like a starfish. But their movements are mechanical. Their voices are synthesized. Their personalities are flatter, more efficient, less prone to the emotional outbursts that define the modern characters. They speak in clipped, polite sentences. They smile, but the smile is a programmed expression rather than a genuine one. They are recognizable. They are also, fundamentally, no longer the same beings. The transformation between the present-day organic city and the future Chrome City is left almost entirely unexplained. The episode does not depict any intermediate stages. It does not show how the residents transitioned from organic creatures to robots. It does not show what happened to the organic species that lived in the modern city. It simply jumps from the present to the year 3999 and leaves the audience to fill in the gap. 2,000 years of history are missing. The fan base has, over the years, developed several theories about what might have happened, and each of those theories carries different implications for the rest of the timeline. The most common theory is that the Chrome City is the result of a slow technological transformation. The species in modern Bikini Bottom, having been mutated by the nuclear testing into intelligent beings, eventually developed advanced technology. They built robots to handle dangerous jobs. They developed prosthetics to extend their lifespans. They began replacing organic body parts with mechanical ones. Across the centuries, the line between organic and mechanical blurred. By the year 3999, the transition was complete. The descendants of SpongeBob and Patrick are, in this reading, the same individuals who lived in the modern era, gradually transformed across millennia into the robotic forms that Squidward encounters. They are not new beings. They are old beings in new bodies. The continuity of the species was preserved, even as the substance of the species was completely replaced. A more disturbing theory is that the organic species died out and were replaced by their own creations. The robots are not descendants of the modern characters. They are inheritors of the city, machines that were built by the modern residents and that outlived their creators. The organic species, in this reading, went extinct at some point in the future, possibly due to a second wave of environmental contamination, possibly due to a war, possibly simply due to the natural lifespan of a species reaching its end. The Chrome City is the city the robots built after the originals were gone. The robotic SpongeBob and Patrick are just visual echoes, programmed to resemble their long-dead originators in honor of a heritage they themselves do not share. The cheerful sponge that the audience knows and loves is, by this reading, dead. He has been dead for centuries by the time Squidward arrives in the future. The robot wearing his shape is a tribute, not a continuation. A third theory, articulated by a Reddit user in a long thread, is that the Chrome City is the result of a successful Plankton victory. In some far future year, Plankton finally accomplished his goal of conquering Bikini Bottom. He used the technology he had been developing for decades to convert the city into a robotic civilization that he could control absolutely. The Chrome residents are, in this reading, citizens of Plankton's totalitarian regime. The cheerfulness of the present-day city has been replaced by the mechanical efficiency of a dictator's empire. The theory is darker than the others, but it is internally consistent with the show's logic. Plankton has been trying to take over Bikini Bottom for decades. The future depicted in SB-129 may simply be the world he eventually built. The Chrome Towers, by this reading, are not a triumph of progress. They are a monument to a war that everyone except Plankton lost. The Chrome City has its own internal hierarchy. Squidward, when he wakes up there, is treated by the robots as an oddity. He is the last organic creature in the city. He is studied. He is examined. He is escorted around by tour guides. The robots speak to him in a language that is recognizably English, but flat and uninflected. They show him the new technology. They show him the new architecture. They show him a museum where artifacts from the year 1999 are displayed as ancient curiosities. The implication is that the modern era of the show, the era the audience watches every week, is, from the perspective of the Chrome City, ancient history. The Krusty Krab is a relic. The Pineapple House is a relic. The Boatmobile is a relic. Squidward himself is a walking relic. The robots treat him with the polite curiosity that a modern museum visitor might bring to a Roman artifact. He is interesting. He is also, in their world, extinct. The Chrome City also has its own version of the Krusty Krab. Squidward, looking for somewhere familiar, finds a building that occupies the same space the Krusty Krab once did. The building is now a chrome tower, but the basic shape is recognizable. He goes inside. The robots there serve a kind of mechanical version of the Krabby Patty. Squidward takes a bite. He cannot taste it. The flavor has been engineered out of the future, replaced by the bare nutritional content that the robots no longer require for sustenance. The patty is, in the Chrome City, a ceremonial object rather than a food. It exists because it has always existed. It no longer serves the purpose it once served. The recipe has, presumably, been preserved across the centuries, but the meaning of the recipe has been lost. The robots make the patty because their programming tells them to. They do not understand why. The episode does not depict any other futures beyond the Chrome City. The audience does not see the year 5000. The audience does not see the year 10,000. The audience does not see what happens after the Chrome City itself eventually ages. But the show has, in scattered references, hinted at even later eras. The Flying Dutchman, who has been alive for centuries already, will presumably continue to exist into the Chrome era and beyond. He is, by canon, eternal. The supernatural beings who populate the deeper history of the ocean are not bound by the rise and fall of any particular civilization. They will be there when the Chrome City falls, just as they were there when the modern city was built, just as they were there when the prehistoric reef was first inhabited. The Dutchman, in particular, has been promised eternal damnation, and eternity does not have an end date. He will outlast the Chrome Towers. He will outlast whatever comes after them. The Atlantis canon also extends into the future. The Lost City, which we discussed in earlier sections, is depicted in the show as having existed for millennia, and as continuing to exist into whatever future eras the show implies. Atlantis is, by canonical position, separate from the timeline of Bikini Bottom. It runs on its own schedule. The Atlanteans have their own internal history, their own internal politics, and their own technology that may, in fact, predate the Chrome City by thousands of years. By the time the Chrome City falls, Atlantis will probably still be there, continuing its own development, indifferent to the rise and fall of the small, cheerful civilization in the shallow reef above it. The Atlanteans in this reading are the long-term residents of the ocean. The species in Bikini Bottom are tourists by comparison, brief visitors whose entire civilization will rise and fall, while the Atlanteans simply keep going. The far future also includes the question of SpongeBob's own immortality. The fan theory that SpongeBob, like real sea sponges, is functionally immortal would, if true, place him in the Chrome City as well. He would not be a robotic descendant. He would be the original SpongeBob, 2,000 years older, watching the world he once knew transform around him. The theory is unprovable. The show has never confirmed it, but the Chrome City would be, for an immortal SpongeBob, just another stage in a life that has already lasted longer than any of the other characters can imagine. The cheerful sponge, in this reading, will outlast the city he was born in, the Chrome City that replaces it, and possibly every city that comes after. He will be there when the bombs fall a second time. He will be there when the Chrome Towers crumble. He will be there for every cycle, every transformation, every renewal of the species. The cheerfulness in this reading is not naive. It is the only sustainable response to a life that long. The Chrome City also raises a quiet question about Squidward himself. He is, in the episode, the only organic creature in the future. He does not belong there. He spends most of the episode trying to escape it, and eventually he succeeds, traveling further into the past to return to his own time. But the implications of his journey have stayed with him. He has seen the future. He knows what is coming. The cheerful neighbors he resents in the modern era will, somewhere across the centuries, be replaced by chrome shells that no longer feel anything. The annoyances he experiences every day will eventually end. The episode does not say whether this knowledge changes how he treats them when he gets back. It probably does not, but the audience knows. The future is coming. The Chrome Towers are coming. The cheerful organic city will eventually give way to whatever comes next. The robotic versions of the characters in the Chrome City raise their own implications. They are recognizable but flat. They are familiar but cold. They are the city's residents, but they are not the city's heart. Whatever made the modern Bikini Bottom feel alive has not survived the centuries. The pineapple is gone. The friendships are gone. The arguments and the laughter and the small daily dramas of the Krusty Krab have been replaced by mechanical efficiency and engineered politeness. The Chrome City is functional. It is also, in every meaningful sense, empty. The cheerful sponge who once flipped patties with genuine joy has been replaced by a machine that flips patties because that is what the machine was built to do. The far future of Bikini Bottom is, in many ways, the show's quiet acknowledgement that its world is not bound by the present. The pineapple house is not permanent. The Krusty Krab is not permanent. The friendships and rivalries that define the modern era will, in some far future year, be remembered only as ancient relics in a museum that the residents of the Chrome City visit out of curiosity. The episode treats this with the same comedic tone it brings to everything else, but the implications are heavy. Everything ends. Even Bikini Bottom ends. The cheerful sponge, the resentful neighbor, the obsessive crab, the lonely copepod, all of them will eventually be gone. What replaces them will not remember them in any way that matters. The future is coming. The Chrome Towers are coming. The cheerful organic city will eventually give way to whatever comes next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Chrome City of the far future is the last canonical era the show has depicted, but the timeline does not stop there. In the final section, we walk through the strange permanence of Bikini Bottom, the cycles that hold the timeline together, and the city that will keep flipping its patties long after everyone watching this is gone. Section 10, the strange permanence of Bikini Bottom, and the cycles that hold the timeline together. The full timeline of Bikini Bottom, when laid out from beginning to end, is one of the strangest pieces of world building in any children's television show. It begins hundreds of millions of years ago in a prehistoric reef where primitive ancestors invented friendship by accident. It runs through a long, quiet stretch when the species lived as ordinary marine animals. It moves through the pirate era when the first recognizably modern ancestors began sailing the seas. It accelerates through the bombs at Bikini Atoll in the mid-20th century. It settles into the modern era of the show with the cheerful pineapple house and the Krusty Krab and the friendships and rivalries that define the present. It extends forward through the post-Hillenburg expansion, the streaming era spin-offs, and the Chrome Towers of the year 4000. It is a timeline that spans, by the show's internal logic, the entire history of intelligent life in this small patch of the Pacific Ocean. What holds the timeline together, when you step back and and look at it as a whole, is a pattern of cycles. The same shapes repeat, the same dynamics repeat, the same friendships, rivalries, and family structures repeat across eras. SpongeGar lived next to Petar in the prehistoric reef. SpongeBob lives next to Patrick in the modern city. The robotic SpongeBob in the Chrome City presumably lives next to a robotic Patrick. The pineapple as home tradition stretches across hundreds of millions of years. The starfish under rock tradition stretches across hundreds of millions of years. The neighbor with the disappointed expression next door stretches across hundreds of millions of years. The civilization changes, the relationships do not. Whatever holds these patterns together is older than language, older than tools, older than the species that currently lives them out. The shapes are the constant. The flesh that fills the shapes is what changes. The crab's family pattern is even older. The crab's ancestors in the deep prehistoric era ran food-related establishments. Grandpappy Redbeard ran a pirate ship that hoarded gold. The modern Mr. Krabs runs the Krusty Krab and obsesses over money. The pattern is the same. The species, in this family, has been collecting wealth and selling food for as long as the species has existed. The Chrome City version of the Krusty Krab presumably continues the tradition, even if the food has lost its flavor and the wealth has lost its meaning. The Krabs family, across the entire timeline, is defined by accumulation. They gather, they hoard, they sell, they protect what they have collected. They pass down the impulse to their children, generation after generation, across millions of years. The first dollar Mr. Krabs ever earned hangs in a frame on the wall of his house. Somewhere in the prehistoric reef, a crab's ancestor probably kept a similarly framed shell or stone, the first thing he ever traded for something else. The frame changes shape, the instinct does not. The plankton family pattern is its counterweight. The plankton ancestors, somewhere in the deep history, were small, scientifically gifted, and lonely. The modern plankton is small, scientifically gifted, and lonely. The pattern repeats. The plankton family, across the timeline, is defined by intelligence that exceeds the body that contains it, and by a desire for recognition that the world keeps refusing to give. Plankton has been failing to overthrow Mr. Krabs in some form for as long as both species have existed. The torn recipe in the dump is, in this reading, just the most recent iteration of an ancient pattern. The two families have been defining each other for millions of years. The friendship that became a feud, the secret that became a weapon, the wound that became a vocation. Somewhere in the prehistoric reef, a plankton ancestor probably stood in front of a crab's ancestor's establishment, denied entry, planning revenge that would never quite arrive. The friendships across the timeline are also cyclical. SpongeGar and Petar invented friendship together in the prehistoric reef. SpongeBob and Patrick reinvented it in the hospital nursery as infants. The robotic descendants in the Chrome City presumably continue it in some mechanical form. The bond between Sponge and Starfish across the entire span of canonical time has been one of the most stable relationships in the universe. They argue, they make up, they share food, they share secrets. They love each other unconditionally, regardless of how foolish either of them has been. The bond is older than language. It is older than the city. It is older than the bombs that mutated their ancestors. It is, by any measure, the oldest social relationship in the universe of the show. Whatever made SpongeGar and Petar choose each other over the fire in the prehistoric flashback is the same thing that makes SpongeBob and Patrick choose each other over every conflict the modern show has put them through. The choice is automatic. The choice is ancient. The relationship between the cheerful innocent and the resentful neighbor is also cyclical. SpongeGar annoyed Squog with his grunts and his oblivious enthusiasm. SpongeBob annoys Squidward with his cheerful intrusions and his obliviousness to social cues. The robotic SpongeBob in the Chrome City presumably annoys whatever passes for a robotic Squidward. The pattern is the same. The cheerful one is always cheerful. The resentful one is always resentful. They are always neighbors. The wall between them is always thin. Across millions of years, they have been irritating each other in roughly the same ways, and across millions of years, neither of them has been able to escape the proximity. The resentful one fantasizes about a life without the cheerful one. The cheerful one does not even understand that the resentment exists. They live next to each other. They will keep living next to each other. The configuration is permanent. The mystery of Pearl's mother is the one piece of the timeline that the show has refused to resolve. She is missing in the modern era. She was missing before the modern era began. Whatever happened to her happened in the late 1980s or early 1990s, somewhere in the years between Pearl's birth and the start of the modern show. The reason for her absence has never been provided. Steven Hillenburg refused to provide one. He believed that the absence itself was the point, and that to draw the missing mother would be to flatten the strange, quiet weight that her absence carries through the entire run of the series. The timeline has, by his explicit instruction, a permanent gap at exactly this point. The mother is in the safe. The recipe is in the safe. Both will, by canonical decision, remain in the safe forever. The fan base will keep arguing about her. New theories will surface every year. The cast will keep deflecting the question at conventions. Lori Allen will keep getting emotional. The mother will stay where Hillenburg left her, in the deliberate negative space at the center of the show. The recipe, in turn, is the other great unresolved mystery. The torn paper that Plankton and Mr. Krabs fought over in the dump is the foundational document of the modern economy of Bikini Bottom. The full version has never been seen. The vegetable composition has been confirmed. The specific ingredients have been deliberately obscured. Vincent Waller has stated that the recipe will never be revealed. The mystery is the point. The patty is, in the canon of the show, more powerful as an unanswered question than it could ever be as an answered one. Once the recipe is revealed, the patty becomes a thing rather than an idea. The economic engine of Bikini Bottom loses some of its weight. The entire show becomes smaller. Hillenburg understood this. Waller understands it. The recipe will stay in the safe. The patty will stay mysterious. The show will protect both. The supernatural figures across the timeline provide the final layer of continuity. The Flying Dutchman has been alive since before the city existed. King Neptune has been ruling the seas for longer than recorded history. The Atlanteans have been developing their own civilization in parallel to the events of the main timeline. These beings do not age. They do not die. They watch. They occasionally intervene. They will be there when the Chrome City falls. They will be there when the next civilization replaces it. The supernatural layer of the universe is the most permanent thing in the entire timeline. The cheerful organic surface comes and goes. The deep mystical structure remains. Whatever rises in the reef, whatever falls in the reef, the Dutchman will be sailing his ghost ship through the same waters, breathing fire from his nose, carrying his bag of souls. He is the reminder that the surface stories are temporary. The deep ocean is not. What the timeline ultimately suggests, when you look at it as a whole, is that Bikini Bottom is not really a place. It is a pattern. The same shapes and dynamics will keep recurring in this patch of ocean for as long as the ocean exists. The species will rise and fall and rise again. The neighborhoods will be built and destroyed and rebuilt. The friendships will be invented, lost, and reinvented. The recipes will be torn, lost, recovered, and torn again. The bombs may have been the most dramatic acceleration in the history of the cycle, but they were not the beginning, and they will not be the end. The cycle continues. The reef continues. The species in some form will continue. The patty will be served. The neighbor will be annoyed. The crab will count his money. The cheerful sponge will keep being cheerful. Whatever shape the city takes, the heart of the city will keep beating in the same rhythm. The cheerful surface and the dark interior of Bikini Bottom have been coexisting since 1999. The pineapple under the sea is a pineapple under the sea. It is also, depending on how you read it, a small piece of survival lodged in the wreckage of a world that ended before any of us were born, or a piece of prehistoric architecture that has been continuing for hundreds of millions of years, or a children's cartoon about a happy sponge who flips burgers. All of these readings are true at the same time. The show has refused, for over 25 years, to choose between them. It has held all of them at once, and it has kept airing, episode after episode, for an audience of children who do not yet know any of this, and an audience of adults who have figured most of it out. The children grow up. They become the adults. They watch the show again with new eyes. They notice the muffler houses. They notice the mushroom cloud explosions. They notice the missing mother. They notice the timeline that stretches in both directions beyond the present moment. The show was waiting for them to notice. The strange permanence of Bikini Bottom is, in the end, the strangest thing about it. A quiet marine biology teacher from Anaheim drew a comic book about tide pools, took it to animation school, pitched it to Nickelodeon with a fish tank in his arms, and ended up creating a city that has now outlasted him. The city sits on top of a real coral reef where real nuclear weapons were tested. The residents are mutated survivors of a war that ended human civilization, or they are prehistoric creatures who have been developing for hundreds of millions of years, or they are simply cartoons. The Krabby Patty is a vegetable vegetable burger, or it is something else entirely. The mother in the safe stays in the safe. The recipe in the safe stays in the safe. The cheerful sponge in the cheerful underwater town will keep flipping his patties forever on top of the ruins of a civilization that may or may not have existed, in a city that may or may not be the only thing left of the world. He becomes whatever the audience needs him to become, and the audience keeps changing while he stays the same. The pineapple is still there. Squidward's moai still sits next door. Patrick's rock has not moved. Every morning, the Krusty Krab opens its doors. Across the street, the Chum Bucket serves no customers. The reef does not stop. The species does not stop. Bikini Bottom has been running on the same quiet engine since the first detonation in 1946, and the engine shows no sign of slowing down. Through every transformation, the same small rituals will keep repeating. A grill will be lit. A patty will be flipped. A friend will knock on a pineapple door. That is the quiet promise the show has been making since 1999. The cheerful sponge is not going anywhere. The patties will keep being made. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.